Hello again, I'm Mindy Mandell, and in this video I'm going to talk about propositions 188 through 190 in Proclus's Elements of Theology. So as always, I will link the playlist here for those of you who would like to go back and look at some of the older videos. And I am using the E.R. Dodds translation of the Elements. For those of you who don't have the text, there is a link in the description box for a PDF. All right, so I will start with proposition 188. And this one reads, every soul is at once a principle of life and a living thing. Now, this is a really important proposition. It clarifies the difference in function between a principle and a participant. And his explanation begins, that into which soul enters necessarily lives, and when a body is deprived of soul, it is thereupon left lifeless. Now, this is very much reminiscent of the definition of soul that Plato gave us in his dialogue Phaedrus. But Proclus, being thorough, has to consider if this function of bringing life is due to the soul or to some other cause. He writes, now its life is due either to soul or to some other cause, and not to soul. But that it should be wholly due to some other cause is impossible, for any participated principle gives to the participant either itself or some part of itself. Unless it furnished one or the other, it would not be participated. So he's clarifying here that being participated means giving something to the participant. If nothing were given, there would not be participation. But he still has to clarify that body does indeed participate soul, which is what he's going to do in the next sentence. Now, soul is participated by that in which it is present, and we call ensouled or animate that which participates a soul. So now that Proclus has established that body participates soul, and so is animated, he is ready to build on this in the next paragraph. He writes, if then it bestows life upon animate bodies, soul is either a principle of life or simply a living thing, or else both together, at once a principle of life and a living thing. So 3 possibilities. 1, soul is a principle of life. 2, soul is a living thing. Or 3, soul is both a principle and a living thing. But if it be simply a living thing and fall short of being a principle of life, it will be composite of life and not life, upon which supposition it cannot know itself or revert upon itself. For cognition is a kind of life, and the cognitive is, as such, alive. Okay, so there's a lot here. First, as for soul knowing itself and reverting upon itself, Proclus showed that to us in Proposition 186. That was my last video, so I'll just quickly review it. And this proposition stated that every soul is an incorporeal substance and it's separable from body. And then in the explanation, he said that it knows itself, and whatever knows itself reverts upon itself. And later he said that it knows itself is apparent, and he gave an argument for that. Okay, I want to focus now on the second sentence here, that cognition is a kind of life, and the cognitive is, as such, alive. So this is an interesting addition. Cognition is a kind of life. Life is understood in metaphysics as a motion, and in the case of cognition, it is the circular motion of ousia. So if there were a part of the soul that was not alive, it would be a part that is not cognizant. And this is why the soul cannot be a composite of life and not life. The implication here is that soul must be cognizant. It cannot contain an element that lacks the cognitive faculty. and this follows from the earlier conclusion that soul knows itself. Is that which is wholly alive and a supplier of life to bodies, then soul is what we would call a principle of life. If, therefore, soul contain a lifeless element, this element has in itself no cognitive faculty. Okay, so now that Proclus has shown soul to be a principle of life, he must show that it is not only a principle of life, but also a participant. He writes, "And if it be purely a principle of life, it will no longer participate the life of intelligence." Notice that he didn't just say that soul participates intellect. He said it participates the life of intellect. It's been a while since I've gone back to Proposition 103, but I think it might be helpful now. This is the one that states that in the triad of unparticipated being, life, and intellect, all are in all. And it reads, "All things are in all things, but in each according to its proper nature. For in being there is life and intelligence, in life being and intelligence, in intelligence being in life. But each of these exists upon one level intellectually, upon another vitally, and on the third existentially." So we can talk of the life of intellect, life that exists intellectually. And intuitively, it makes sense that life must be an intellect because intellect too enjoys its own proper motion, namely the motion of cognition or ousia. And back at Proposition 188, Proclus writes, "For that which participates life is a living thing, and not purely a principle of life. The pure principle is the first and unparticipated life." So now Proclus is setting up here that the pure principle is unparticipated life. And so this takes us back to the part of the book we were just looking at. We were looking at Proposition 103 a moment ago, and that showed that unparticipated being, life, and intellect were all in all. But these unparticipated terms were first introduced here in Proposition 101, and this reads, "All things which participate intelligence are preceded by the unparticipated intelligence, those which participate life by the unparticipated life, and those which participate being by the unparticipated being. And of these three unparticipated principles, being is prior to life, and life to intelligence." So this is the pure principle of life, but this is not soul. Soul participates this life, as does intellect. And so this is why Proclus writes that the pure principle is the first and unparticipated life, while that which is consequent upon it is not only a principle of life, but also a living thing. So now Proclus is setting up that soul can be both a principle of life and a living thing. And he wraps it up by stating, "Now the unparticipated life is not a soul. Therefore, soul is at once a principle of life and a living thing." So soul is a principle of life to bodies, and also, as a living thing in its own right, it is a participant of intelligible life. Now, this last point of being a living thing in its own right is spelled out even more directly in the next proposition. All right, so Proposition 189 reads, "Every soul is self-animated, or has life in its own right." So here's how Proclus sets up the argument. "For it is capable of reversion upon itself, and all that is capable of reversion is self-constituted. So then soul is self-constituted and the cause of its own being." Now, being capable of reverting on itself, that was again Proposition 186, which I already reviewed. The next step is that all that reverts on itself is self-constituted. That actually also follows from Proposition 188, because we saw that soul is not both life and not life, and it's a principle, therefore. But the idea of self-constitution was specifically Proposition 43, which states very directly that all that is capable of reversion upon itself is self-constituted. And so the conclusion of this first sentence is that soul is self-constituted, which means being the cause of its own being. But again, soul is both a principle of life and a living thing, and its essential character is vitality. So far, this sentence is just a restatement, really, of Proposition 188. The soul's essential character is vitality. Now he's going to describe what this means. He writes, "For where it is present, it communicates life by its mere being, and the participant, if it be fit for the reception, straightway becomes ensouled and alive. The soul does not calculate or choose, nor is it in consequence of any calculation or judgment that it animates the body, but simply through being what it is, it endows with life that which is adapted to participate it. Its being, therefore, is being alive." So what he's saying here is that there is no moral judgment as to which bodies deserve to be ensouled and which do not. Sometimes we know that good people die young, and some not so good people live long lives. Participation is determined by the body's ability to participate. That's all. Conditions such as injury and illness can end participation, but not unhealthiness in the soul. Now, I do want to briefly comment on this notion of creating simply through being what it is. This is an important point to come back to from time to time, because it really is a central idea of what it means to be a principle. And this is Proposition 26, that every productive cause produces the next and all subsequent principles, while itself remaining steadfast. These principles imitate the one, and if the one brings its consequence into existence without movement, then every productive cause has a like law of production. And so to conclude, Proclus writes, "If then its being is self-derived, and this being is the being alive which is its essential character, then its life too must be self-furnished and self-derived. That is, soul must be self-animated." Now, self-furnished here is really just another way of saying it is self-sufficient. And again, if you want to review self-sufficiency, that was Propositions 9 and 10. And self-derived here is really just a restatement of the term self-constituted. And that was covered in Propositions 40 through 51. All right, I'd like to spend the rest of the video looking at Proposition 190. And this one reads, "Every soul is intermediate between the indivisible principles and those which are divided in association with bodies." In metaphysical discussions, there's a lot of talk of soul being that link between the physical world on the one hand and the intelligible world on the other. Or sometimes we talk of the temporal world and the eternal, or the realm of coming to be and that of being, or that which always is. But here we finally have the proposition that directly addresses this function of soul as the link between those two worlds. Now, in this first sentence here, we see the building blocks that Proclus is going to use as his foundation. He's starting with the soul being self-animated, which means that the soul's nature is vitality. And also that the soul is self-constituted, which of course means that it is the cause of its own being. And then thirdly, that the soul has an existence that is separable from bodies, which is what we saw in Proposition 186. And so in this first sentence, he tells us that if it is self-animated, self-constituted, and it has this existence that is separable from bodies, then it is superior to all principles which are divided in association with bodies and transcends them. And he goes on to say that such principles referring to principles that are divided in association with bodies, these such principles are wholly inseparable from their substrates. They are partitioned together with the partitioned bulk, and falling away from their own nature, which is without parts, they are infected by corporeal extension. Inseparable from their substrates in this case would mean that if soul were of such a nature, it would not be separable from the body that it incarnates. So this is describing what would be the situation if soul were divided in association with bodies. Next, he says that if they be of the order of vital principles, they belong as life principles not to themselves, but to their participants. What he's referring to here is what he later developed in his Theology of Plato as the realm of nature. Okay, so soul does not belong to the realms below it, but now he's going to show that it also does not belong to the realm above it. If they be of the order of being and the forms, they belong as forms not to themselves, but to that which they inform. Then he goes on in the next paragraph to say, but on the other hand, if besides being these things, a self-constituted substance, a self-animated life, a self-cognitive knowledge, and on all these grounds separable from bodies, the soul be also something which has life and consequently being by participation, and knowledge too by participation of causes distinct from itself, it will then plainly be inferior to the indivisible principles. The word substance here is ousia, and so we can see in the first part of this sentence a triad of a self-constituted ousia, a self-animated life, and a self-cognitive knowledge. We can depict it something like this, analogous to the intelligible triad of being, life, and intellect. But notice the later part of this sentence. The life, being, and knowledge in the soul are all by participation. Therefore, the soul is inferior to the intelligible principles. And this brings us to the next sentence. Now, it is evident that it draws its life and consequently its being from a source other than itself. For prior to soul, there is both an unparticipated life and an unparticipated being. So he's pointing here to the intelligible triad. And that was introduced, of course, in Proposition 101, which I just reviewed a few minutes ago. But now, seeing that the unparticipated principles of each of these series are prior to soul, I think that part is easy enough to see. The more difficult point is the next sentence. Again, he goes on, that it is not the first cognitive principle is apparent, since whereas every soul as soul is alive, not every soul as soul has knowledge. There are souls ignorant of reality, which yet remain souls. So this can be tricky. There is a certain cognitive faculty in souls, but it is by participation. Souls do not have nous, they participate in nous. Those that participate in nous possess it, those that don't do not. I'm going to look at an exchange in Plato's Republic that I think helps highlight this. Okay, and this is from Book 6 of the Republic. Socrates is talking to Glaucon, and he says, "You are aware that when the eyes are no longer turned upon objects upon whose colors the light of day falls, but that of the dim luminaries of night, their edge is blunted, and they appear almost blind, as if pure vision did not dwell in them." Glaucon says, "Yes, indeed. But when, I take it, they are directed upon objects illumined by the sun, they see clearly, and vision appears to reside in these same eyes." Certainly. Now Socrates asks him to apply this comparison to the soul also, in this way. When it is firmly fixed on the domain where truth and reality shine resplendent, it apprehends and knows them, and it appears to possess reason or nous. But when it inclines to that region which is mingled with darkness, the world of becoming and passing away, it opines only, and its edge is blunted, and it shifts its opinions hither and thither, and again seems as if it lacked reason or nous. So when the soul participates in nous, it possesses intellect. When it does not, it meanders through the realm of becoming, functioning only at the cognitive level of belief. This idea of soul participating in intellect rather than possessing it primitively actually can be found here in Proclus's Elements of Theology. I want to take a quick look now at Proposition 20. Proposition 20 reads, "Beyond all bodies is the soul's essence. Beyond all souls, the intellective principle. And beyond all intellective substances is the one." Now, what I want to focus on right now is this part here that I put in yellow. It is through intelligence that soul participates in perpetuity of thought, as body and self-movement through soul. For if perpetuity of thought belonged primitively to soul, it would inhere like self-movement in all souls. Hence, it does not belong primitively to soul. Prior to soul, then, must be the first thinker. That is, the intelligence, or nous, is prior to souls. And so there it is. I'm going to return to this proposition in my next video. For now, though, I want to take a look at the rest of Proposition 190. Now, it is open to debate whether rational soul extends to any animals outside of humans. Certainly, though, this statement describes most humans who do not know themselves or the realm of reality of which we're a part. Many don't even know that we are soul because they identify themselves with the body. He concludes then, "Soul then is not the first cognitive principle, nor is it by its mere existence knowledge. Its existence, therefore, is secondary to those principles which are cognitive primally and in virtue of their being." So here he is pointing to intellect, which is cognitive primally. He ends by stating, "And since in soul existence is distinct from knowledge, it cannot rank with the indivisible principles. But it has been shown that equally it does not rank with those which are divided in association with bodies. Therefore, it is betwixt the two." And so this is Proclus's conclusion, that soul is between what he is calling here the indivisible principles, or the intelligible principles, and those associated with materiality. So if you found that helpful, I would appreciate you hitting the like button. That really does help the channel. And also, if you don't already subscribe, I hope you'll think about doing so. And if you have any questions or comments, please do not hesitate to put those below.